Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new conversation in the Gerhard Center webinar series. Today, we are so glad to be hosting our special guest speaker, Richard Georg Engström, the founder and the managing partner of Impact Business Modeling System. Richard is a seasoned entrepreneur in technology, advisor, investor, and financier of projects, ventures, and organizations with a social and environmental positive income. Since the mid-1990s, Richard has been part of the Nordic and international ecosystem of startups and venture financing. Today, he works as an advisor, entrepreneur, and investor in solutions with the purpose to improve systematically change the world to be more balanced, equal, and prosperous for each and everyone. Richard, thank you so much. We are looking forward to a great conversation. Richard will lead the conversation and he will talk to us about making sustainable impact measurable, operational, and profitable. Thank you so much again, Richard. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. It's nice to be part of your activities here with the Gerhard Center and the American University in Cairo. I'm very happy that you invite me. I have worked, as you said, since the mid-90s in innovation and venturing and also investing with startups, and I'm a serial entrepreneur myself with my first internet venture back in the late 90s with some venture capital out of the Nordics. But over years, I worked very much in the Nordics and Baltics and also in Europe. But I haven't worked really with the Middle East when it comes to startups and in investments. I worked a little bit in Asia and also in US. So I'm happy that you are trying to bridge the activities we do and have in the Nordics and in Europe towards Middle East and northern part of Africa. Because I can see also from other partners that we work with that there is a lot of things going on now in a lot of especially northern and eastern African countries, where countries as, for instance, Rwanda and Uganda and Nigeria and South Africa, there is a lot of activities there. And I know from some partners also that there are a lot of things going on in Cairo and Egypt when it comes to business angels and startup technology and so on. So I'm happy to join and give some ideas on how we work in the Nordics, but also maybe get some questions or some conversation here with your network on how can we bridge activities from northern part of Europe or Europe towards Middle East and Africa. So I'll do an introduction here for 20-25 minutes on where do we come from, how do we work, and then how do we actually work with investors and incubators and accelerators on helping startups to only not have an intention to do good in the world, but actually can put some quantification and figures on what do they actually improve in the world and how can they measure that. And then after that, I'll take some questions or comments from the audience. So I look very much forward to that. So I think I will just start here to share my screen. And I do it like this. And I guess you can give me a thumbs up, Karim, that you see. And you can also see this site here. And you know, when I think about things, this is maybe the view most of us like to have in the morning. Some great place with a lot of nice nature. But that's not the way the world looks like anymore every day. This is what we see also now in Europe, wildfires. And even in Northern Europe, we see flooding. And we know from decades back from 80s, 70s, 60s, that there's been drought and starvation and so on the African continent. So as recent as 2015, incorporated in 2016, we put out those 17 sustainable development goals in the world. Those are areas that we need to improve to be able to survive, maybe as humanity, and protect all the goods we have, especially within nature and environment. Unfortunately, even if this agenda is picked up by politicians, large companies, by innovators as the ecosystem we work in, and also by investors, this is what things look like. Still, CO2 emissions are increasing exponentially year by year. There are parts where we are improving. We can see here in Europe, European Union, that we are actually decreasing. But when it comes to the global part of this, including some of the larger areas of the globe, like India and China and Asia and so on, it's going in the wrong direction. And if you look at the way we behave as citizens or consumers or commercial entities in the world, we can see that back this year in November 2022, Black Friday sales were higher than ever. It topped over $9 billion for the first time. So even though we acknowledge that we have a lot of challenges and we have a common agenda through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we are not changing that much, most of us. So if this is where we want to go, we have to ask ourselves, what is the agenda and how do we actually behave? When the 17 Sustainable Development Goals came out in 2016, there was a consortium of a lot of companies, large companies in the world, and politicians and policymakers and NGOs. They wrote a report that was published in, as you can see here, in January 2017. And they are the ones that said that there might be a 12 trillion US dollar market based on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the first time when I heard that and saw this report, I thought, wow, that is fantastic. Think of what an opportunity for us to make leverage on those challenges for business. But not long after, I thought about myself, that's actually the big problem here. The big problem is that we, as companies, ask ourselves, what can sustainability do for us? How can we leverage? How can we make money and business out of those challenges? Instead of asking ourselves, what can we do for sustainability? How can we change our operations? How can we emphasize on the partners in our supply chain to change for the better? And I think that's the big problem here, that we are seeing now from business side, whether we are corporates, startups, or investors. How can we leverage and make more money out of the green transition or sustainability, instead of asking, how can we change ourselves so we actually don't push such a big pressure on nature, environment, and climate, and also social causes in the world? So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do for sustainability? And you know, some of you might have changed your transportation the last couple of years into an electric vehicle, maybe a Tesla or some of the others. And we need to ask ourselves then, how much do we actually improve by that? Now, we are not an open forum here, so I cannot really ask you if you know what is that improvement that you do if you change to an electric vehicle the last couple of years. But if you look in average, if you drive 60 kilometers each day to work, some shopping and recreation, that is about 15,000 kilometers per year. That is actually reducing 2.2 tons of CO2 on a yearly basis. And that is based on an average energy mix of fueling your car with electricity in a year, compared to a standard diesel or petrol car. If you look at that, that's the same thing as consuming 100 grams of meat, which means a small burger or a piece of meat or 5-6 slices of ham during breakfast every working day for 200 days. So if you stopped eating meat at your lunch, for instance, at work, that is the same thing as changed to an electric vehicle. So we need to set those things in context. So actually buying an electric vehicle might not be the case if you're into improving the world. Maybe you should change instead yourself and your behavior. And if you look at this from where you do this, so if you change to electric vehicle in Sweden, which have nuclear power, which in EU is considered to be sustainable because there is no emissions from that. Compared to Poland, where everything of electricity is based on coal, which means that when you charge your car in a charger, in Sweden, it's electricity produced by nuclear, and also in France, for instance. But in Poland, the electricity comes from coal, which means that there is a 500 difference in renewable energy sources in Sweden compared to Poland. So for most cases, there is no need to buy electric car in Poland. Just continue, spend, use your car that you have in advance. Maybe you change yourself in another way. For instance, stop, have meat at lunch. That would be a much larger improvement if you live in Poland. And this is a big problem because we don't know too much about this, so we don't change our behavior. And we change sometimes behavior based on storytelling or imaging instead of actually understanding how do we improve ourselves. And that's what we have been working on for quite some time now with innovation in startups and also venture investing into startups with a focus on sustainability, or as we today call impact investing. So we have been an early mover in this ecosystem when it comes to sustainable solutions and impact. So our background is that we started out in 2015 to coach some social entrepreneurs, we call them at that time, and help them with fundraising and commercialization. And over a few years, we built a network of investors interested in this area. And we saw that this will be a new market and a new layer on top of that ecosystem of startups and investors within technology. So we started to do yearly analysis on the market. We have looked at 7,000 Nordic impact startups. We have made quite some survey with impact investors in the Nordics on how they go from intention. We have picked out 50 companies out of 1,500 every year. We match them with several hundreds of investors in our summits. And we have a platform today with 2,000 Nordic and Baltic impact startups and around 450 international investors that are matching themselves on data. So we understand this ecosystem very well and been part of that for quite some time. So we came from social entrepreneurship into what we today call impact business and investing. And today it's a well-structured market. It's not a discussion anymore if I do social or environmental improvement as a business, if I can make a lot of money compared to technology companies. you actually have an easier potential today to raise funds for startups with sustainable solutions, because that is becoming the mainstream market. So if you look, for instance, in the Nordics today, impact startups are in great position and they have a huge increase in investment capital. In 2022, last year, 2 billion euros were invested in impact startups. That is broadly companies within renewable energy or waste management or water improvement or agri-food system solutions or social inclusions, or even solutions for Africa within starvation and inclusion in the digital economy and digital marketplace and so on. So 26% of our Nordic venture capital was deployed for those kind of solutions last year. In Sweden, up to 31%. We have 7 Nordic impact unicorns, large companies that actually provide solutions in energy, in health, and in social causes. So this is a huge market, and it's broadening out now throughout Europe and also in other parts of the world. But there is a leadership in this area of solutions and capital in the Nordics. So we are not anymore in the discussion of social entrepreneurship, if that is impact first or financial return first. We don't talk so much about ESG or impact. We are here now. We are talking about how do we actually make those companies measurable so we can benchmark them, not only on the business figures, but also on quantification on their impact. So we, as investors or customers, choose the right solutions because they have a larger impact than the other solution, and they are still doing a great business. And we can see then from all those companies we work with that less than 3% of those companies have an idea on how to quantify and measure and report on that. And if we look in Europe primarily, we can see that investors, they like to benchmark. So they are not only looking at the business case today, they're also looking on those companies and what an impact do they have and how do they measure it. And if they cannot quantify it, they will not come into our due diligence for our venture fund. They are left out of it. When it comes to customers, they are also focusing on those suppliers that have a quantification on how they help them. Very much in the B2B sector, in industry, in retail, and so on. Companies that have an idea on how they improve the world and can quantify it, they are actually in the forefront as suppliers into larger companies. And a lot of startups are suppliers to larger companies. So we need to get away from those great green stories to evidence for change. And if you might know, some of you, that in Europe, we have something now called the EU taxonomy. We had a political agenda that was put in place between the member states called the EU Green Deal from 2019. And then we made a classification system, which means that EU have classified what is sustainable environmental impact and what has not, which means that companies and investors should no longer be doubtful about if this has an impact and it's quantified or not, which means that regulation today in the EU says that you cannot market yourself as a green product or a sustainable product. That is not prohibited, that is not allowed anymore. You have to tell how you are specifically changing the world. So you can say, we are reducing so much CO2 compared to another product in our category, or we are reducing so much kilowatt hours of energy, or we are improving this and this with those impact units and quantification. So in marketing, you can have a fine, which means you can be banned from authorities if you say that you have a green product or a sustainable product. You have to be specific. And this regulation is also broadened out now outside of EU. So countries like Canada and a few other countries are actually taking the learnings from the EU classification, the EU taxonomy, into their regulation systems in their part of the world. So we said to ourselves that we need to help startups to have some kind of lean methodology on how can you improve the world in a good way as you work with different other tools. And then we said we have to then evolve the conventional business model. So if you look at the conventional business model today, you often define a commercial problem. So you see that there is a problem in a certain area, and we have some kind of technology or product that can make that faster, cheaper, more efficient, more convenient, or cost benefit. And then you bring on your solution, you have tests on customers, and you find the right channels and activities for that. You bring on the right pricing, distribution, put the resources and leadership, and then you go out there and run business. But we all know that business, as well as we as citizens, we have a footprint on the world. And that is actually the problem we stand with today. And business is very much a part of that. So we say we cannot only think about market and business, we need to see market as one part of the stakeholders. So we need to take a systemic view on business modeling. And we need to look at contribution as business that can contribute positively, but also have externalities. We also need to think about society, environment, nature, climate balance every time we bring on a new product and service. And we need to think about that we are not only providing contribution with business so we can employ people, or we can have taxes and we can have welfare, but we always have externalities in everything we do, and we can strive to be net positive impact. So we said to ourselves, how do we then business model for the future? We said, let's do an impact business model methodology and help early stage companies to do that. So we are not thinking so much about what is the problem and what is the solution. We think very much about if there is a problem regards to social, environment, climate, what is the vision? How would we like to see the marketplace and the world to be if the problem was eliminated? And then you'll talk about what is the change we need to see in the world. And change is the only thing you can measure on. You cannot measure on a problem. You can quantify how big is the problem, but you can measure on the change, the improvements. And then you look at the solution. How do we then solve that problem? And then you can quantify that with the indicators and metrics, so you know how much kilowatt hours of energy you might reduce in a building, and therefore you reduce CO2 emissions, or how much water consumption you reduce in industry, or how many hectares of land that you reduce use of pesticides, or how many people that are vulnerable out of a handicap that can come into the marketplace. And then you can show evidence that the problem you saw and the change you like to see, so the world can be without that problem, your solution is measurable and you can show evidence of that. And then you start to think about how can we contribute to environment, to the social causes, to climate, and how do we negatively also have an impact on the world that we have to be better on as companies. And then as a leadership, you can then say, how do we align with the expectations? How do we align with the expectation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? How do we align with the EU taxonomy classification? How do we align with other policies made in different countries or regions? How do we align with the expectation of citizens and consumers? And then you take leadership because you're being accountable for your operations. So we have brought out this impact business model methodology as impact business modules. So we train startups, but we work with their portfolio owners, the incubators, the accelerators, the investors, and we help them to go through this logic so they'll be measurable and operational. So the output from those companies is specifically that they get the metrics. So Julia, who is running a company, they do a biodegradable material, which means that instead of using polystyrene, a plastic and fossil-based material, which takes around 100 years to degrade, they have a material that is biodegradable. So they have put leftovers from agriculture into mycelium, which is mushroom roots, and then they grow a material. And that material can be biodegraded in 30 days when it's used. So L'Oreal, they package their perfume bottles in this within the packaging, and then they can biodegrade it in 30 years in composting. So now Julia and her company Eslab, they know that every time they have a kilo of their material compared to polystyrene, they know exactly how much CO2 do they reduce, how much water do they reuse, and that there is no landfill with polystyrene. So that's the outcome for those companies. So we as investors and customers can say that, okay, wow, so if I buy your product or use your software or system, we can quantify exactly how much an impact we have still doing business together. And we work then with accelerators and VC funds throughout the Nordics, and now we also have a customer in Berlin in Germany that uses our system. I think I'll do 5 minutes more here, quickly tell you about a case. What is the outcome of what we do for a company? So you see a little bit of how is this happening. This company is out of Estonia in the Baltics, in the northern part of Europe. They're called Ringy. They have a marketplace for refurbished electronic devices, which means that they either buy your electronic device back, the used smartphone, laptop, game console, PC, tablet, and so on. And then they sell you not a new one, but a newer one, which is refurbished, that you can use, and you have 12-month guarantee and free shipping, etc. But they don't do the refurbishment themselves. They have a network of refurbishers, so they are you could say a marketplace for that. And I bought a lot of electronics there myself, for myself and my family. So we are behaving in a way that we don't use electronic devices that much long. We will buy new ones, and most of us have also electronics devices lying at home, and that's a big problem, of course. If we can monetize them and reuse them, the world would be more circular and better. So that's what they do. So their problem, and what you see now, is all the outputs of being coached in our systemic methodology, so they can build something that is measurable and operational. So the problem here is that we overconsume electronic devices. We don't use things as long as we could. That has three negative effects. Climate, because if we don't use electronics that much and we waste them, then we produce new ones. So there is a lot of emissions from producing new electronics. We have a lot of waste that we don't handle. So that is a waste stream that is unused of components and spare parts. And nature, we damage nature when we do mines, and we also extract those precious and scarcity materials such as gold and platinum and palladium and cobalt and so on. So that's the problem. So their vision is saying we dream of a world where all electronic devices last longer and get recycled. So how do we do that? If we think that we envision a net positive electronic device industry, what is the change we need to see in the world then? We need to reduce CO2 emissions from producing new things. We need to extend life cycle on existing devices. We need to increase upcycling of parts, and we need to increase recycling of material. And we have a solution that we sell refurbished and we buy back used. So we can then measure on specific indicators, such as avoidance of kilos of CO2, increased time in market, number of spare parts, kilos of material. So then we help the company, okay, say if this is your goal, what do you then need to measure? If you want to reduce CO2, then you need to measure of how many refurbished devices you have sold. And you can get the data in the platform with Ringy because they use the serial number when you buy something or sell something. If you want to extend life cycle, then you measure, of course, time in the market. And then you look in the platform from user to user on the serial number, how long a life has this device. If you want to increase upcycling possibilities, then you need to measure how many spare parts do we reuse. Ringy cannot measure the spare parts in their platform, but they can ask their suppliers for data on how many spare parts have they reused in the system from the ones that were not able to be refurbished, that became donors to the ones they have to repair. And same thing, if you want to recycle activities and increase that, then you measure reuse of material. And you also do that with your refurbishers. So for them to be able to measure on this, they can measure things incorporated in their technology, some things they have to ask their refurbishers by contract to supply that. And then they can make a forecasting. So each device has a forecast. So you know exactly what is the life cycle and how much CO2 do you emit in the sourcing, production, transportation, distribution. And then you can look into forecasting data. So you know if you produce a smartphone and you distribute that, that is actually 63.5 kilos of CO2. If you instead provide a refurbished one, so you avoid production of a new one, then this is what you actually avoid of CO2 emissions. And that you can put on for components and for devices. So they can use that in their measurement. So they do a metrics where they say, okay, let's then have a success criteria, not only on how much we sell and our margins and our bottom line, but how much CO2 do we avoid? How much life cycle do we extend? How many spare parts do we upcycle? So if this was the 17th of May and Ringy today sold 1,000 smartphones on their website and bought back 50, or 300 tablets and bought back 15, or 500 laptops and bought back 25, then they could say exactly that we today avoided 600 kilos of CO2. We extended life cycle of 90 devices and we reused 162 spare parts. So that's the way they measure themselves on an impact success. And then they make that operational. So they built into their dashboard, in their sales dashboard, so they can see every day that if we sell from day to day, month to month, we know what is our revenues, what is the CO2 avoidance, what is the extended life cycle length, and how many spare parts. So we can, on an annual basis or on a daily basis, every time look into our database in our dashboard and see how much CO2 did we avoid today, or how many spare parts did we actually upcycle this day, 17 May 2023. And that's the way we work with companies. So we help them to define the change, put the indicators on, and build the metrics so they can every day, every month, every year say and report on this. And then they can use that obviously for their customers and investors to be precise on how do they improve the world, and they can put figures on that. And then we help them also with SDG alignment and with EU taxonomy. So that was an introduction to where do we come from? What is the impact business modeling system? How do we work? And this was the case. So now I leave it for you here Herman, to moderate some interaction with the guests here. So thanks a lot for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. That was very impressive, reflecting on our context in the region. There are a lot to learn and navigate. Before we open the floor to the audience to ask their questions, let me ask you like a couple of questions. One of them is actually related to governance. Like achieving effective and real change will not happen if businesses or startups are operating in a vacuum. I can imagine like a proper engagement and harmonization between the private sector, government, and civil society is necessary. This entails like adequate ways of governance on both corporate and ecosystem levels. I'm interested to know, how do you navigate this issue and how you coach your clients and partners to properly engage communities, civil societies, government in the whole process, from defining impact or defining change to the operational interactions. Is there a way by which the private sector actors can measure the effectiveness of their engagement with government and civil society?
There are two things to this. First of all, the companies that we work with, and the main part of impact business modeling system is that we help the companies on a solution or a product or service that like to improve something in the world. So we help them to define what is that problem and what does the world look like if the problem was not there. So what change is needed? And then when you do that analysis, you can see that there are different changes, and some changes might be social, societal, environmental, and climate. So you get through that work, you get kind of a, you could say, stakeholder mapping, where you see some, with ours, the problem we have defined and the change we like to see, that needs changes not only in environment or in climate, but it means that it needs some changes in different areas. So if you look at, for instance, Africa, and some work we do with a fund for African solutions in agriculture and food, there are three main issues. One is actually a nature issue. How do they treat land, the soil, the land, and the nature? Another issue is, how can they improve emissions of CO2? And the third thing is a social context. How can they help smallhold farmers to have a larger cut of that business they provide, so they are not squeezed by middlemen or large corporates? Which means that when you define such things, you can see that there are actually a climate improvement, a nature improvement, and there is a social improvement. So when we work with this, each company looks into those different areas. Some are only working on one area, some work on different areas. So that is one thing. The other thing we do is that we also try to help them to do some kind of understanding on, that's on the solution level, the first thing. The second thing is that how do you operate as a company? Do you significantly harm with your operations? So one thing is the solution on a problem that can solve social, environmental, nature, climate challenges. But then we also try to have them emphasize, a small startup from 3 to 5 people early on, they don't have a big footprint, but they can get into a big footprint if they accelerate fast and grow within a few years. So if they are early on understanding, how do you, when you operate, have a positive or negative impact on people, on nature, on environment, on climate. So they get a perspective that they might solve some challenges, but to be able to build that and operate that, they have some negative impact. And of course, then they have to understand that, and then they have to do a governance so they relate to those stakeholders and make a partnership with them. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Richard. We have a question, Shirat. I think Shirat, please feel free to unmute yourself and address the question directly to Richard.
Thank you. Yes, hi. Thank you very much. It's very nice to have you, Richard, at AUC. Again, very fascinating, detailed discussion, and I like how you moved from, where things used to be with social innovation or entrepreneurship or impact, and all the way to the vision you have and the frameworks that are much more established than where we began. So thank you very much for that. I have two questions. One has to do with how do you deal with the diversity of the issues that you dealt with, even in your response to Kariman right now? You mentioned, agriculture, natural resources versus, as you mentioned, packaging. How do you classify the clients you deal with in terms of internal organization in your company in order to group them in a way that you have retained knowledge or retained learnings? Do you see any trends that were interesting to you? Like, you saw some groupings about size of organization versus location in Africa, for example. How do you build a repository of knowledge in your organization to push this forward? And that's one question. I have another one.
Yeah, very good. Yes. Shall we start with that?
Sure. No,
okay. I mean, listen. You could say what we do is that we help them on a managerial level, which means on the leadership, to build a logic in their impact intention, to be connected with their business, which means with the technology and the product service and the business model and the leadership, and bring that into the world. We help them to structure it so they know what are we trying to change, how do we measure that, and how do we quantify it and make it impact metrics. But we are not specifically deeply engaged in a certain area of energy or food or agri or social or migration or waste or so on. But we know how to support them to find the right sources, especially on the data piece. So for instance, my colleague Mikkel, he works with a partner of ours, which is called climate impact forecasting. So we can help them to say, that, okay, those are the changes they like to see. This is the indicators and metrics we built, and we know what to measure on. And in some areas, we can translate that to a CO2 equivalent, for instance. And then we can use the tool. So we can guide them to understand what is the supply chain, how do you source, how do you produce, how do you transport and distribute. And then we can use different tools and guide them towards where are the right sources for that understanding or that data or other tools that you can dive into and be specific on your, especially on figures, you could say. But what we do is more helping them to build a logic. It's, the business model canvas, maybe, that there is an international canvas, you could say, for how do you see a business model. And we have built a logic and a methodology on how to build in your intention to do good, so it becomes measurable and operational into your business. And when we are getting into specific data or competences, then we know where they could go to get that specific insights. So we are more on the generic process and business modeling than specific in certain areas, you could say. But we have a good understanding where to guide people towards.
So yeah, so that was kind of thank you for answering that. So on the retained knowledge, on the data analytics, you're saying that a new client is for you as equivalent to, or a new sector is the same way you would deal with this as you had dealt.
For instance, I mean, if we work with a company that have social inclusion, say people that have are vulnerable because of ADHD, we can build the same logic in that service and business and indicators and metrics, so they know what to measure and how to measure. I can give you an example. Two examples very quickly. We work with one company from India. They put up IoT sensors in hotel and restaurants so they can see how much energy you consume. In lighting, heating, fryers, all kind of stuff. So they can guide them. How do you reduce kilowatt hours of energy use? How can you translate that into CO2 reduction? That is an energy specific company. We work with a Norwegian company that help teachers to bring in usage of devices into their training in school. Some children have a problem to just read and use books. They like to use new technology in the way they consume or understand history or different, and then they measure them on how did they improve in character, how did they continue through school, and how did they continue to more education. So they have 3 indicators on did they end school, did they have a better character, and did they continue to new education. And they built that metrics from Avrio on energy consumption and Ludenso on social indicators from the same logic.
I got it. Thank you. That's it. So on the climate ones specifically, on the energy ones and the emissions, did you get any pushback from any measurements you made that would make you recalculate things in a different way, calling you overinflating or underrepresenting? Is there any pushback you're getting from any group? Because there is a lot of standards, there is a lot of debate there, right? And that's my last question. Thank you, Kariman. So thank you.
Could you be a little bit specific? I'm a little bit uncertain what you're asking for.
Measuring impact is a big discussion that goes beyond one, right? So especially when it comes to emissions and how, and net zero. So did you get any pushback from the way your metrics are developed, whether because you are showing forecasting, impact forecasting, and people can argue that that's too inflated or not. Do you get any
yes, I mean, listen, if you really think about this on a macro level, even if you do an LCA on a product, a life cycle assessment, you will never be 100% sure that LCA, and even if you work for months and investigated all the sourcing of material and the production and manufacturing and transportation, distribution and usage and waste and so on, you can never be sure exactly if that's the externality, which means if that's the emission. So we have to take that with a little bit of salt. What we work with impact forecasting is even a larger pinch of salt, because that is maybe 80 to 90% true, because those products are not already defined yet, because we work so early on in innovation. So we can see that more as a guidance towards if you design a new electronic device or a shoe or some kind of system in agriculture and so on, you can do a forecast on how did we produce this piece of technology, how did we distribute, and how did we transport it, and so on. And then you have an idea on, are you doing better than the existing product in the same category than others? And you have to take it into that. So I think that if you look at economics, that is very, very precise on figures. I think even if in the future, we will never be 100% precise on actually the complexity of a supply chain for a certain product or service. So we have not got pushbacks, but of course someone had asked us, how can we be sure that those figures are the right ones? And we said, you cannot be sure, but as long as you are transparent and honest about how you have designed your figures, then that is better than not having anything. It's like, it's better to have a bad plan, than don't have a plan, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sharat, for the great questions. Thank you, Richard. We have another hand, Abdallah.
Sure. Thank you, Kariman, and thank you so much, Richard, for this story all about the impact business model. I'm really glad that you shared the case about Ringy, because it just made me realize how the process is. And what I wanted to question is that when I saw the problem statement, it looked at a very macro level kind of detail of what the problem is from an environmental perspective. While from a business perspective, I feel like Ringi's actual problem is that customers don't really have access to affordable, insured, and kind of environmentally positive or environmentally green digital devices. And when I saw how the impact business model goes on, it kept emphasizing on the impact, kind of moving Ringi into a sustainability consultancy about how the supply chain can become more green. But when I look at Ringi's, when I look at their kind of website now, all I see is that the iPhone and the price, and there's kind of no mention of the environmental impact. So what I'm questioning here is that, is the impact business model or the impact model that you're suggesting more of a quantifying tool, and how is that integrated into the customer perception?
Well, I mean, if you look in their back end, you cannot do that, of course, because that's the back end in their service. They can always look into the figures on what is the improvement of what they do on CO2 emissions and an extended life cycle and spare parts. If they use all that data or not in their marketing towards customers and others, that's of course something that they decide on themselves. But I think that what we do here is that we help companies go from, you could say, the great story of intention, because even if a company has a great story and they have a solution, and if Ringi didn't have their metrics, of course they would have some kind of impact anyway. It would be better to buy a refurbished thing than buying a new one, at least for the environment, right? But we would not know how much. So I think that what we help them is to go from that intention to make it quantified as good as we can with the data we or the startups have, and make it operational so they can really see how they progress on a daily basis on that. And then, of course, they can be better over time to verify the data on what is the emission avoided if you don't produce a new device compared to buying a refurbished one. And as I said here to Sherwat, we can never be 100% sure about that, because that is extremely complex to do measurements on products, from all material to a product to distribution and uses and waste and upcycling, recycling, etc. I hope that.
Kariman, is it okay if I just follow up quickly just to make sure that
yes.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you. So what I get is that, yes, I get the indicators, I get the quantification, and I feel like it's more geared to the investment side, so they can actually be sure about where the money is funneled in. And
you could say that.
From the customer perspective, or from the actual business perspective, how is it helping Ringi's positioning, for example? How is it helping its segmentation? How is it helping it grow and scale, not just the business, but the impact?
That's a great question. The key word here is actually reliability, because there are so many new products now. One thing is startups, but if you go into the supermarket today, you know how many new products, at least if you go in Europe, you can see only in the area of plant-based products, within plant-based drinks and plant-based food that take out milk or yogurt or meat or such. There are so many new products, and they all tell about how they are plant-based or green or sustainable. And of course, if you can show evidence in quantification towards consumers and say, if you buy our plant-based food product or our plant-based drink, you will reduce so much CO2 or water usage or whatever it is. And we can put the quantification. So 1 liter of our drink means these kind of improvements, as well as you have all the other specifications of what kind of nutrition does it have, vitamins and proteins and so on. So I think that quantification, they get out of that. They can use it as a reliability tool towards customers, so that it's not just a great story, but it's actually something that is tangible and that is measurable.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Thank you, Richard. We have another question from Rihab.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation, very inspiring. My question relates to the markets that you actually focus on. A lot of your discussion or presentation was about Nordic countries, and then you mentioned India in one of the answers. I understand fully that the more aware the consumers are, the more demanding they will be of companies to actually have a positive impact and reduce emissions and act responsibly. So my question is, have you had clients from our part of the world, from the MENA region or Africa in recent years who are keen to actually utilize such a good methodology and business model to measure their own impact positively or negatively?
Yeah, we have not. We have worked with companies throughout all the Nordics, Europe, and also Southern Europe, and also countries like a handful of companies out of Turkey, actually, which is not so far from you. Work with some companies in Greece. We also work with some companies in Kazakhstan and in Armenia, in that area, and also in the southern part of Balkan, Yugoslavia, and Romania, and so on. We have not worked with that, but at the moment we are, and I can just not put a name on that, but at the moment we are building a partnership with a venture fund out of Cairo that will actually raise money out of Middle East and also in Europe for investing into African startups within agri and food systems that have focus on climate, environment, climate and land, including soil, and also on social context. And they will use then our system to coach their portfolio companies in that sense.
Okay, that's very, very inspiring and very interesting. Good to know. Thank you so much.
Are you working with such things, Rehab, within incubation or acceleration or what?
I do have a consulting business, and I work on social impact actually, and I also do strategic planning for companies. So since 2019, I'm trying to integrate sustainability into their strategic plans and objectives. The appetite is not very big, and it's a lot of because I focus on small and medium companies. A lot of them are not there yet. They have more pressing, immediate economic and financial issues, especially in Egypt in the last few years. But my vision is it's not a luxury anymore. Everybody needs to integrate sustainability. So that's why I'm curious, and if
you like, I think there is a link from the American University website to our, or at least I can write our website here on the chat, and you can find me. You can write me a mail, because we also have a model where we work with consultants so they can be certified in our system. I just now put our website here in the chat, and you can find me and my email there. If you like, you can write, and we can set up a meeting, and I can tell you a little bit about how we work with partners and have them to incorporate our methodology into their business consulting.
That's fantastic. I would definitely reach out to you. I'll try to connect through LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Richard. Unfortunately, our time is up. There are still a lot of questions there, and the conversation is not over. This is just the start of the conversation. We are so interested and intentional in making this conversation going on, because as some of you know, we are working on a project with the Ford Foundation, where big part of the project objective is to raise awareness and bridge the gaps between the investment space in our region and other parts of the world. So we learned a lot today, and we are looking forward to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very, very nice hosting me, and thanks a lot for the conversation here in the end.
Thank you so much. Bye.